Welcome to today's Global Connections television program. I'm Bill Miller. What role did the UK, United Kingdom, play in the founding of the United Nations in 1945? What role does it play today in many areas of the UN, especially as a permanent member of the UN Security Council? My guest today is going to bring us up to date on the role of the United Kingdom at the United Nations. My guest today is an expert. My guest today is Deputy Permanent Representative Ambassador Peter Wilson for the United Kingdom mission at the United Nations. Before joining the UK mission, Ambassador Wilson served as Asia Pacific Director at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in London, where he covered North and Southeast Asia and Australasia. Your Excellency, Peter Wilson, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you for having me, Bill.
I appreciate you being with me today. Let's go back. Let's go back 70 years, go back to 1945 and talk about the founding of the United Nations. It came really out of the ashes of World War II. We saw 60 million people were killed, Europe lay in ruins, parts of Asia had been destroyed. How important was it for the countries of the world at that time to come together to form an international organization such as the UN?
Well, I think it was hugely important, and I think what fascinates me about that early history of the UN was the idea, first of all, that nations were coming together to try and do this before the end of the First World War. The second thing, so real hope in and faith in the power of diplomacy. The second thing that fascinated me about that time was that when the UN was formed, and we were a major driving force in that, the first meeting of the General Assembly of the United Nations, which was actually held in Westminster in London. But the thing that fascinated me was this was allies coming together after the Second World War. What's happened since is a massive shift. So from the 56 nations who founded the UN, we've expanded to an organization of 193 nations. And we've expanded from an organization of a smaller group of like-minded to a much larger group, which basically makes us a universal organization. And that gives us a different kind of power.
And the UN of 1945 dealt primarily with peace and security, reconstruction, that type of thing. We look at the UN of today, what are some of the major issues that it's dealing with that they never even contemplated back in 1945?
Well, actually, you say that, Bill, and you're right that there was a huge focus on reconstruction. There was a huge focus also on decolonization. But one of the things that was never foreseen by the founding fathers of the UN was actually one of the most important things about the UN today, which is peacekeeping. So at the time, there is nothing in the Charter of the United Nations about peacekeeping at all, whereas Ban Ki-moon today has over 100,000 troops under his authority and under the authority of the Security Council. So that's one very big difference. The other big difference is this huge focus in the UN now on development. And for us, as a country that contributes 0.7% of our GDP to development, that side of the UN's work is as important as the peacekeeping side of the UN's work. So we're a big Security Council power, we're a member of the Security Council, but we also are a big development power, and we believe that part of the UN's role is vitally important.
Now, the UK is one of the major contributors at the United Nations. I think you're the 5th or 6th largest, something like that.
We're actually, Bill, we're the 2nd largest.
Oh, you're second largest.
If you take into account our voluntary contribution and our compulsory contribution together. So we have a big contribution that we make. We're the 5th largest in terms of compulsory contributions. We have to do that, but we also think it's right that we do that. But on top of that, we contribute over $1 billion a year in development funding, and we choose to do that because the UN is a very good organization to put our money through.
If we could go back to peacekeeping for a moment.
Sure.
You mentioned it was not included in the Charter, and that's absolutely correct. But it has become to a large degree, the face of the UN to some degree. The Security Council and peacekeeping, those are the two entities that you hear so much about.
Yes.
Now, Security Council is the most powerful organ of the UN, but peacekeeping, you mentioned over 100,000 troops. There were 16 peacekeeping missions. I think Liberia is about to wind down, I believe. I heard something to that effect.
It is. We still have to agree that, but
Have
yes.
to agree. Okay, it's in the process. But why is it so important to have peacekeepers in these very dangerous areas of the world to help people to try to rebuild their lives? First, be safe, and then secondly, to try to rebuild their lives.
Well, I think that the UN is uniquely positioned to do this kind of work because, as I said at the beginning, we have become a universal organization. So if the countries of the world in the Security Council, and all shades of opinion are represented in the Security Council, if we can agree that a UN peacekeeping mission is necessary, that is a very, very powerful force for legitimacy. And The UN peacekeeping missions around the world have changed a lot over the last 40, 50 years. Their nature has changed. If you look at a peacekeeping mission, an older peacekeeping mission, like one that protects the border between Israel and Lebanon, it's a very classic peacekeeping mission, basically keeping two sides apart who might otherwise fight. If you look at some of the newer peacekeeping missions, like in South Sudan or in Mali, they have actually a much wider role. So they have a role in protecting civilians, they have a role in helping the government deal with terrorism, and those are very, very big things. And if you don't have legitimacy, then those forces can be in very serious trouble. But the UN is an enormous legitimizing force, and by taking troops from all around the world, and we do take troops from over 50 countries around the world, by taking them, those forces have a legitimacy that if you had one country doing it, just wouldn't have the same kind of consent.
That raises a very important issue with, especially when you have troops that come in, I think there are like 135 countries or something, like a huge number of troop contributing countries to the United Nations peacekeeping, and some of the troops are very well trained,
yes,
extremely well trained, others not so well trained.
That's right.
Not as well as the first group, let's say. Is there some way that, and maybe the UN's doing this already, is there some way they could have some sort of a universal generic training for all of the troops to try to get them at the same level? Would it be in everyone's best interest maybe if the UN had a standing army? A lot of people think the UN has a standing army, which it does not. It's not even close to one. But it raises those issues. Are those ones that should be discussed, or are they being discussed right now?
But I think the whole issue of how we reform peacekeeping to make it more effective in the 21st century, that's a massive issue at the UN right now. And a big report was done last year to try and increase effectiveness. So we looked at training, we looked at planning, which we think is particularly important, and we looked at expanding the group of troop contributing countries. You're right, there's quite a long list. We actually wanted it to get even bigger. And there are some countries that don't contribute very much. We wanted to expand that. And my country decided that we were going to double the number of peacekeepers that we were contributing to UN operations. The problem with doing a standing army approach is that if you're going to do that, you really have to have a lot of countries committing large numbers of troops who may be sitting around doing not very much. You also reduce countries' ability to say, look, this is a place where we think we can make a big contribution, but that place, maybe for political reasons, maybe for national interest reasons, is a more difficult place for us to operate. So every peacekeeping mission has to be composed differently. Every peacekeeping mission has to have, if you like, the consent of the troop contributing countries to act in that particular area. And I think we're not at the stage where you can basically just take a group that you could just move around the world regardless of where they were. But what you can, I think, expect is that we're better planned. What I think you can expect is that troops are better trained. And I think what you can expect is that troops are better equipped. And actually, we've done a lot of things to make sure that troops are really well equipped, because they are in some very, very tough terrain. It's not a universal standard, but we're much, much closer now, I think, to achieving a basic minimum standard that people need to stick to.
And that sums it up, I think, very nicely, because they are in some very difficult situations. Sometimes they're lightly armed, sometimes they don't have all the resources they need. They're literally staring into the face of danger, and they don't even have they don't have the resources around them, just the logistics to be able to carry out the function. But still, they're the only game in town. They're the ones who are bringing peace and stability to that area, and it's very important. One other thing too, if there were a standing army, it would cost a lot more money than it does today. And there are many myths out there about the United Nations. Some people think it's a one world government, which it's not. Some people think it's loaded with money, which it's not. But it would cost much more to maintain a standing army.
No, that's definitely true.
And the UN does actually keep the cost down. If you look at the UN peacekeeping, the budget's about, what, $8.3 billion a year.
It's actually just gone down just below $8 billion in this last year. It's just under $8 billion. For the last 3 years, it's been just over 8, and it's just dipped under 8. It may go up again.
And that's for 16 peacekeeping missions.
That's right.
Which is very, very inexpensive. When you look at $1.6 trillion spent on armaments every year around the world. We were talking about, you mentioned the Security Council, and earlier I think I mentioned it was the most important or most powerful organ of the United Nations. The United Kingdom, along with China, Russia, the United States, and France, you're one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. There are 10 rotating members who serve for 2-year terms. What role do you play as a permanent member, along perhaps the other 4 permanent members of the Security Council?
Sure. I mean, I think for all the permanent members, because we are there all the time, we have a lot of experience. But for my country, for the United Kingdom, the key thing is we want the UN to do things. We don't want to stop it doing things. We want it to do more. So on the Security Council, we see our roles very much as a catalyst for action and as a catalyst for change. So we are very, very rarely in a position where we want to block things happening, to stop things being done. We're usually in a position, and usually we're in a majority in the Security Council, where we want the Security Council to take action, we want the Security Council to agree, we want the Security Council to do more. So I would say that we are a country that sees our national power magnified through the United Nations. We're not a country that sees our power diminished by it. And for that reason, the more that the UN does, the more agreement there is in the Security Council, the more action we can achieve as a result of it, the better for us.
And really, the only way to achieve victory or to be successful is through collective action.
Correct.
Is that not correct?
Absolutely
we have to
right.
do it that
Absolutely.
way.
No, we have to agree. And there are 5 members of the Security Council, and we're one of them, that have a block on action. We have a veto. But the United Kingdom hasn't used its veto since 1989. And to be frank, if we did have to use our veto, we would view that as a failure of diplomacy, not as a success.
I know there are many challenging issues before the Security Council right now. We could sit here for the next hour and tick them off, but what are the 2 or 3 of the major ones you're dealing with right as of today, so we speak about them?
Sure. I mean, top of the list for me, Bill, has to be Syria. I mean, this is an issue that the Security Council has grappled with for the last 5 years. It is not the Security Council's final hour, precisely for the reason that you were talking about earlier, which is that in order to achieve things, we actually have to be able to agree. And the Security Council is famously blocked on some key issues to do with Syria. I think what people occasionally fail to see is that on some things where we have managed to achieve agreement, we have made some progress. So on chemical weapons, for example, there has been progress made through the Security Council. Syria has signed up to the Chemical Weapons Convention, finally. But we've also been able to identify real problems. And so last week, a report was published by the UN, which made it clear that the Syrian regime, despite the commitments it had made, is still using chemical weapons on its own people. And that is a very, very major problem. The UN's identified it. The UN's agreed that this is happening. Now we need to make sure that the people who are doing this must be held accountable. The other area where we have made some progress, but not nearly enough, is humanitarian aid. And again, there are way too many people in Syria who are not getting the aid that they need. But the fact that some people have and that some people are is thanks to the UN. It is thanks to the very, very brave officials of the UN Relief Agency, OCHA, and to the huge number of NGOs who are involved, that some people are receiving help. So there is progress, but on the bigger picture, the political talks, they are at the moment stalled, and that is a major problem for us. That's just issue number 1.
Number 1. Okay. We got many
Shall
more,
I go on?
We got many more to cover in just a moment. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. If you have an interest in these international issues, we would encourage you to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with any type of media outlet, be it a PBS, community access television station, or perhaps an intra-campus university network, a television hookup, or just a website, and you would like to share these programs, please do so. Go to our website and feel free to download them. Global Connections Television is provided free at no charge as a public service to help people better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're taking a look at one member of the United Nations, one of the 193 member states of the UN, the United Kingdom, and the role it plays as a permanent member of the Security Council. My guest today is Mr. Peter Wilson, who is a Deputy Permanent Representative of the UK mission to the United Nations. Your Excellency, we're talking about these issues. Mention 1 or 2 more. We could spend, like I say, the rest of the day, but 1 or 2 more.
Well, let me take a rather different example, an example of a big issue on which the Security Council actually has achieved a wide level of agreement, and that's Somalia. So Somalia is a country that in the past has had major political problems that many people have in the past described as a failed state, which is rebuilding itself. And this is an area where, because the Security Council is united in its desire to help the Somali government to help the Somali people build a new state, where I think we've managed to achieve a remarkable degree of agreement, and we have managed to achieve success. And that is a success that's primarily due to the Somali people, but it is also due to the fact that the international community is united. It's also an example of an area where we work very closely with the African Union. So it's a very interesting, it's not a peacekeeping mission, but it is a UN logistical support mission for African troops who, under the AU banner, the African Union banner, are basically helping to fight terrorists and rebuild the state of Somalia. And so on that, progress is very fragile, but elections are expected this autumn, and this is a massive, massive change from 10 years ago, where Somalia really was a failed state, and terrorism, Al-Shabaab, was causing huge problems, not just for the region, but for the whole world.
You mentioned that there's reshaping, reformulating the agenda, and of course we know that the Security Council deals primarily with peace and security in very dangerous areas of the world, but it's getting so now, it seems as the Security Council has broadened its mandate. Is the Security Council not discussing climate change? Is it not discussing human rights in the from the generic standpoint as parts of the solution for the peace and security issue? Is that something new for you?
It is, and it's something where the United Kingdom has been very, very keen to make sure that we do discuss these wider issues which impact on peace and security. I mean, I should be very clear. We do these things because we think that they have an impact on peace and security. That's the Security Council's business. But climate change is having a massive effect on security issues around the world as people fight for resource. Human rights, we would regard, if you like, as the canary in the coal mine. If you're looking at preventative diplomacy, which we talk a lot about at the UN, and we talk a lot about it in the Security Council, how do you know when something's beginning to go wrong in a country? It's when there is problems with the human rights situation. And that's why we think that human rights issues can be, aren't always, but can be hugely important for the Security Council, and we view that as part of our wider discussions. Finally, I'd say that if you aren't getting issues of justice right, it is very, very hard to see how you can have peace. Some people say you can't have justice if you don't have peace, but it's equally true, you cannot have peace if you don't have justice.
Very, very true. The situation with the Security Council, we've been reading, golly, since back in the 80s, I guess, maybe even before that, of various ideas on how to reform the Security Council. There's been a push to maybe expand the Security Council, maybe expand the veto. There are various countries that want to be members of the Security Council, maybe with veto, such as Japan, Brazil, South Africa, Germany, and probably many others too. Does the UK have a position as to what the reform of the Security Council might look like, or a particular approach that you are proffering?
Sure. I mean, we are very keen on Security Council reform. We've said for a long time, and you're right, it's been a debate which has been going on for a very long time, since the mid-60s. But we've said very clearly that we think that Germany, Japan, Brazil and India should all be permanent members of the Security Council. We also say that there should be permanent membership for Africa, and that's an issue for Africa to choose which countries, which 2 or 3 countries they think would most appropriately serve on the Security Council. We also think there should be an expansion in the non-permanent member category. You mentioned the veto bill and expanding the veto. I have to say my personal view is we should have less vetoing on the Security Council, not more. And we were actually one of the key countries that was behind an initiative last year in the UN to get countries to commit, in cases of mass atrocity, not to use their veto. We have had examples in the UN in the past where countries have sought to use their veto to prevent action which would have stopped many, many people dying. We want that to end. So as I said right at the beginning, we would say that for us, what we want in the Security Council is more action, less blocking, not the reverse.
And this is an extremely important issue, and one that I'm sure we'll be discussing in the future. With the veto, not to go into it in too great a detail, but how could we handle that veto in the future? Would it take, if there were a veto, would it take 3 of the 5 or 2 of the 5, or would you have to have more than just one of the 5 members veto some particular resolution, which is binding on the party to whom or at whom it's directed?
I mean, I think always the balance with these kinds of issues is how much you can get a council of powerful countries to agree that they are better sharing sovereignty and surrendering some sovereignty in order to solve problems. I think, frankly, the fact is that the veto is here to stay, but how people use the veto and what price they pay for using the veto, in our opinion, that should be as high as possible. In other words, if a country is going to use the veto, they need to have a very, very good reason for doing so. Blocking the Security Council is usually something that causes major problems rather than solving major problems. We accept countries need to protect their sovereignty, but in the Charter it is very clear that sovereignty is only one of the two major principles in the UN. The other is the duty to intervene when countries could be doing something either very bad to their neighbours or very bad to their own people. Both of those principles exist side by side in the Charter. We would err very much on the side of saying the UN, the international community, has a duty to protect people who are unable to protect themselves, either because their governments refuse to do so or because they're threatened by a powerful neighbour.
We've talked about the Security Council, some of the reforms, possibly suggestions on strengthening the Security Council, making it more efficient, more effective. If we could broaden that out to the UN, you're an expert on the United Nations. You've seen the UN from outside, you've seen it from the inside. What would you suggest? Are there 2 or 3 suggestions as to how the UN can be a more effective and a more efficient organization, given that it's certainly not the UN of 1945 and is dealing with issues today that the UN never contemplated? They weren't dealing with Ebola in 1945, they were dealing with climate change and many others. But are there any suggestions you have as to how to improve the UN?
Sure. I mean, I think for me, Bill, the first thing is leadership. And we are debating at the moment the selection of the next Secretary General. The leadership of that individual is hugely important for the vitality of this organization. I think the second thing is a group of people at the top of this organization who really believe in working together and using all the different bits of the UN to achieve things that we want. In other words, not a siloed approach where each agency is doing its own thing, but a collective approach where the UN is really greater than the sum of its parts. I think the third element of this is, you said quite rightly that on many issues like peacekeeping, if you look at the UN objectively, actually it is not an expensive institution. But still, there are many examples of where resource could be better used. There are many examples of where the way that the UN is run could be brought more in line with a 21st century organization. It is tough to achieve change in international organizations when you need 193 countries to agree, but we think that there is more that can be done to use resource efficiently. All of that, though, comes down to this key question of who we choose to be the next Secretary General and who that person then chooses to be around her or him to help them run an organization that really does operate for the benefit of the citizens of the world. So we're at a critical moment at the moment, so I'm glad you asked me that question. We need to get that choice and the choices that flow from it. We need to get those choices right.
You're quite right. Excuse me. By the time this program airs, we will know who the next Secretary General is, the 9th. So. That's right. Well, I think we'll know. Let's put it like that. It's often been, well, it was often said, let's say from the first Secretary General, Trygve Lie, who said to Dag Hammarskjöld that being the Secretary General is the most difficult job in the world. In the last 30 seconds we have, is it the most difficult job in the world?
I certainly think it's one of them. And I think what you need is somebody who is prepared to take political risks, but who also has real political awareness so that they can actually achieve results in the world. So yes, I think it is one of the toughest jobs in the world. We've got some good candidates. Hopefully by the time this airs, we will have chosen one of them, and it will be clear to the world that we've made a good choice.
And of course, that is a challenge for the Secretary General, who has a board of directors of 193 governments, member states of the UN General Assembly, just deals with every major issue, every problem in the world. There's probably not one issue the UN is not dealing with that has some type of international implication. I have not heard it up to this point, but you're absolutely correct, and it is an organization that we need. It's not a perfect organization, but it is one that is absolutely vital. And if the UN, it's often said, if it went out of business today, we'd have to recreate it tomorrow. But Your Excellency Peter Wilson, with the UK mission to the United Nations, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
My pleasure. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television. I'm Bill Miller.